Tonight I'm going to look at another poet, as I said I would, somebody who actually knew George Herbert that we looked at last week. I'm going to look at John Donne. Many of you will know a little bit about John Donne, maybe. If I say the words John Donne, does anything come to mind? What were the first words that come to mind if I say John Donne to you? Anything? Undone. So,
For whom the bell tolls.
For whom the bell tolls. Oh, I think I'm going to go now. You might as well just do it yourself. Mark up this flea. Mark up this flea, yes. I mean, talking about school, like Andrew was just talking about, John Donne was a bit of a sexy poet that we all sort of giggled over when we were doing O-level, shown a bit of John Donne. So there's sort of a bit of sex with John Donne, a bit of raunchiness. But, of course, as we discover, and this is something that's often said, there are two John Donnes. I don't like this binary thing, but some people say there's a sort of John Donne, Jack Donne, who is the young, sassy, audacious woman lover, and then the later Dean of St. Paul's Dr. Donne. But I'm going to try and show that that's a bit too simplified. One thing I would say, if I was going to do a sort of young and old thing, I'd put it like this. I think John Donne, when he was younger, was excited by the nakedness of his body. And when he was older, I think he was afraid of the nakedness of his soul. I think you can feel that. And let me try and embellish that a bit this evening. So what I'm going to do, if this is all right with you, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about his life, what we know about it. Then I will tell you a little bit about the poems, and then, as we did last week, we'll look at some. And I've again just chosen some of those I like most, but also I've tried to choose ones that are fairly well known. And then I do want to just touch on what you might call the poetry of his preaching. Because when John Donne died, it was not as a poet that he was famous. It was as a preacher. And I've just put an excerpt of a sermon on your handout, which we'll look at, and I just so that you can hear, as it were, the poetry in the sermons. And I'll just explain to you what a sermon was in Donne's day. It's very different from a sort of 8-minute homily behind a posh-looking deck chair like this. It was quite a different animal altogether. So I say to you, what do you think about when you think of John Donne? He lived from 1572 to 1631. He is, as you probably know, one of the greatest poets in the English language. He was also an adventurer. He was a scholar, a diplomat, a preacher, as I say. He was a Catholic and then a Protestant. He was a promiscuous youth and lover of parties. He was later a devoted husband and father and Dean of St. Paul's. As a person, I think he was passionate, assertive, contradictory, witty, imaginative, and clever. One thing you learn about his sermons is he was extraordinarily well read. When you talk about a conceit in a poem, what you're talking about is the sort of clever juxtaposition of two things that create a new thing. And a lot of people think that the conceits of his poems are a little bit too clever and are a bit overworked sometimes. The best comment I've ever read from a literary critic on this is, the thing about John Donne is, he says, his brain rather went to his head. He was an exhibitionist, I think. He was self-dramatizing. He was displaying himself all the time, but like most exhibitionists, he had a lot of secrets. And being one of the so-called metaphysical poets like George Herbert, he's looking into the human and beyond the human. And his anxieties, I think, as a human being, feel very contemporary. Who am I? What does it mean to be alive? What is belief? What is faith? Do I have them? What lies beyond death? And of course, like all the metaphysical poets, he's always thinking in metaphors as he explores those themes. When people ask sometimes what my definition of a good poem is, and of course, answers please on a postcard. But one of the things I often say is, in a good poem, something unforeseen has suddenly become indispensable. So you encounter a poem, something happens in the encounter, something unforeseen. And what you've encountered, what you've perceived, the feelings that have emerged, whatever it is, they suddenly become something you want to hold on to and keep. They become indispensable. And for a lot of people, this is the power of Donne, that there is the unforeseen, which becomes the essential. I think he was a juggling act between self-conscious and soul-conscious. Perhaps we all are. And if you're interested at the end of this session in learning anything more about him, there is a very recent biography that's come out called Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne by Catherine Rundell. Fascinating woman, Catherine Rundell. She's a fellow of All Souls, Oxford. She's a children's writer and a tightrope walker. And this book fizzes. That's the only word I can think. She has such an excitement about John Donne. It's beautifully researched. Some of her descriptions in it are equal, I think, with some of Donne's own metaphors. I particularly liked on the picture. You can't really see it in the picture on the front of your handout, but he's actually wearing a great big floppy hat. And she says it was big enough for a cat to sail in. She's full of it. It's full of sort of imagery like that. And one thing she says in this about John Donne is she says he believed that if you tap a human being, they ring with the sound of infinity. It's a rather beautiful way of putting something back. He was self-conscious, but it was part of a soul-conscious journey. For me, one of his great qualities is that although he is looking within and beyond, Walter de la Mare once said that when you read John Donne, you never throw off the world. So there's no little miracle that suddenly sorts everything out. There's nothing that suddenly makes you innocent again or mystically unites you with God in some serene perfection. Herbert, of course, in his poems often has this at the end, a sense of fighting with God, a little bit of adolescent temperament, and then at the end, God says, "Oh, come on, George, cool it." And he goes, "Yeah, you're right." And they sort of... In John Donne, you don't get that so much. The world is always still there in all its complexity and density. And as I say, you do get people talking about those two John Donnes, but that idea of him being excited at his body's nakedness, but discomforted by his soul's nakedness, I think, it is there and very evident. He writes of himself in one sonnet, "To vex me, contraries meet in one." And you get those sense of the contraries that make up him always coming out. And I think we'll discover those a little bit this evening. And I think that's why he remains popular, is because he doesn't try to hide his contradictions, his contraries. Anyway, let's just quickly look at his life. So he's born in London. So George Herbert is your pastoral poet. He's walking to Salisbury to read the song. He's seeing the farmers. He's hearing the sheep. Lovely. John Donne, no. John Donne is a Londoner. He's a metropolitan poet. He remained a city man throughout his life. He's born in Bread Street. He ends up at St. Paul's, which is where he dies. So he literally is born and dies in sort of two places that are visible to each other. Interestingly, they've just fairly recently, put a bust of Donne outside the cathedral on the south side of the cathedral. And interestingly, he's looking away from the cathedral, looking towards Southwark Cathedral, actually. He's got taste. He's not a pastoral poet and never could be, as he always complained when he wasn't at the heart of the metropolitan goings-on. He was the third of 6 children. His father was an ironmonger, but let's not think that he was a great big sort of working man with his welders. He was quite a well-to-do merchant who was an ironmonger. But he only lives to see his son for 4 years. So when Donne is 4, his father dies. His mother, John Donne's mother, was a daughter of a poet and playwright, and she was a descendant of Sir Thomas More. And her family was heroically committed to the Roman Catholic faith. She actually died only 2 months before Donne did, in 1631. So actually, Donne and his mother, travel through life together. Donne had 2 uncles who were Jesuit priests, and his great uncle, Thomas Heywood, was a Catholic martyr. More importantly, I think, and I say this, I think it's more important because he hardly ever writes about it. So I think it went very deep, and he couldn't even pick up the pen about it. But his brother, Henry, gave refuge to a priest and was sent to prison, sent to Newgate prison, and dies of the plague in there. He was 19, I think. He was awaiting trial, and that affected Donne very deeply. Donne actually said at one point, no family has suffered more in their persons and fortunes for the Roman Catholic faith than had his own family. There's a very strong sense of this. And you do find some of the sort of psychological readings of Donne's poems will often say, we think this is a rather important thread in his writing, that there may be a very strong sense of guilt at having walked away from the faith for which his own family had actually given their lives. But certainly that Catholic faith shapes his childhood. It stays with him. He studies at Hart Hall in Oxford. He goes to Oxford at the age of 12. This was so he didn't have to take the oath of supremacy at the age of 16. As a Catholic, he was barred from taking a degree. He proceeds to Lincoln's Inn in 1591, where he makes a name for himself as a widely read wit, who, though never is called to the bar, ensured that he called on the court, and he plays the romantic and servile games that are necessary for social acceptance. And Richard Baker, who was a contemporary of his, and this is a quote you often find about the younger Donne, Baker described him as a great visitor of ladies, a great frequenter of plays, a great writer of conceited verses. Of course, people love honing in on the first part of the quotation. And it's in this early period that he writes what are called his elegies, the satires, some of the songs, and the sonnets. And the thing about Donne's poems is that it's really difficult to know when they were written. So if you want to, the best volume, I've put it in the recommended reading, a huge collection of John Donne's poems, have lots and lots of notes because people are trying to work out when they were written, where they were written, and so on. And of course, what happened was, you don't just Google poem in this day, or poems are passed around. They're copied out, they're passed on. What happens, because human beings are fallible, is they make mistakes. So they get it wrong. They pass it on. They get it wrong. So we have lots and lots of manuscripts of the early jottings of Donne's poetry, but of course they will have a slightly different word or a different bit of punctuation. And people try to work out, if you're a scholar, this is the sort of thing you do. You try and work out which was the original, which was later added, and so on. But the great dense collection is full of notes because we don't always know when these poems were written. It was around, we think, about 1595 that he decides to leave Rome, as it were. Again, there are many PhDs written on why. Some will say it was deep down change of faith. And some will say, well, he knew he had to if he wanted to get on. It wasn't going to work if he kept his Catholic faith. It may, of course, be something in between those two or both. We are full of contraries. Anyway, in 1596, he gets in a ship and goes off to Cadiz as a gentleman adventurer with the Earl of Essex and Walter Raleigh, remember him? And then another less successful voyage to the Azores. He sees rather horrible things there. There's battles going on, and he sees, he talks at one point about seeing a Spanish ship hit, go up in flames, and seeing all the Spanish jumping into the sea, burning, all alight. And this sort of goes into his memory in a very unpleasant way, and he talks about it quite a few times. So he goes on these adventures. He doesn't really make a great name for himself, but he does secure a post as one of Sir Thomas Egerton's secretaries. Now, Egerton was the Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. Basically, he's a legal man. He's in charge of the legal life of the state. And Donne makes, through his work for Egerton, makes a lot of contacts. He actually becomes an MP for a short time for Brackley. But things go horribly wrong. In 1601, he married Anne, who was the young niece of his employer, in a secret ceremony. The Savoy Chapel, a friend of his from Cambridge comes and does it, and it's all done under wraps. And eventually he comes clean about it, of course, and Anne's father, Sir George Moore, was furious and refused to acknowledge the marriage or to make any financial provision. Egerton dismissed Donne from his service because of this, and Donne goes to prison. And as somebody just gave voice to, it's around this time that John Donne writes John Donne and Donne, undone.
Second.
And his life sort of falls apart. I often think Anne Moore, who becomes Anne Donne, not too much attention is ever given to this person. I think she was a rather remarkable person. She had a very nice life, all set for her. There was lots of money. Life could have been great fun. And she ends up, because of love, with John's, and they scramble around for cash, and they end up out in Mitcham, which then was not where you wanted to end up. John Donne gets very restless because he's a long way out of London, gets very sort of fidgety, and they have a lot of children, and Anne's sort of bearing it all. And one thing I think I can say definitively about John Donne, I don't think he would have been easy to live with. He writes at one point, "Nothing but men of all envenomed things doth work upon himself with inborn spleen." So of all venomous animals, the only venomous animal that bites itself, that stings itself, is a human being. And I think, was he talking about himself a bit here? One of the things that this biography says about Donne is that he believes that human beings are both a miracle and a catastrophe. However, the marriage is discovered and proclaimed to be legally valid. And it proves to be a rather strong, loving backbone to what becomes now a rather vulnerable life, socially and financially. He's looking for patrons wherever he could. He's writing to get a bit of cash. He goes on some long journeys abroad. Again, his wife's left there looking after all the children. And as I say, he acquires a house in Mitcham, and while he's there, he's always just trying to get back into court, into favour. He isn't successful at landing the appointments he wants, particularly those at the king's disposal. He continues to write, however. He wrote letters, and a lot of people say, oh, you must read poems, and then there were the sermons. They often forget Donne's letters, which are rather profound and beautiful. He writes theological essays. I'm not going to particularly commend those to you, as they're very long for a start. And as Rundell says, it would actually be easier to eat them than to read them. He continues to study at home, law, philosophy, literature, but he does suffer, a bit like Herbert did, perhaps everybody did, with great ill health and a lot of despair, a lot of black dog. And it's around this time that the religious poems start to get written. Donne had always been interested in theological matters, and as I say, he's moved, for whatever reason, towards the Church of England, away from his Roman Catholicism as the years pass. And in the end, he resolves, he says, to make my profession divinity. And he's ordained in Old St. Paul's Cathedral on the 23rd of January in 1615. And then he does start going up the ladder. He's appointed chaplain in ordinary to the king. He's made a Doctor of Divinity by Cambridge University. They didn't want to give it to him. They were forced to by the king. So they really didn't want to. And then he's made Reader of Divinity at Lincoln's Inn. And it's now that he starts to learn the art of preaching and crafting with this poet's eye and tongue the sermons that certainly captured a lot of attention, which I'll tell you about a bit later. Anne dies in 1617. She was pregnant for the 12th time. The 12th time in 16 years. And she has a stillbirth and then dies later. And this shattering event made Donne reflect at a very deep level on his faith, his humanity, his God. He has 7 surviving children. He never remarries. He seems to have wanted to be considered for the appointment of the Dean of St. Paul's. And for once, just for once, his wish comes true. And he's installed in 1621, and he takes upon himself now all the responsibilities of that position, whilst at the same time enjoying the security and status that this brings, and a load of dosh. You're really quite wealthy to be the Dean of St. Paul's. There are a lot of monies coming in from various livings that were connected to the role. Those days have gone.
Sure.
This period at St. Paul's was a very fruitful period of his life, but again, ill health comes back. He gets painfully weaker. He preaches a last sermon at court. People were very moved by it. They published it, called Death's Duel. And somebody said, watching him, by then he was exceptionally thin and, emaciated, really. And somebody said he was preaching his own funeral sermon. And eventually he dies in 1631. He's 59 years old, which is quite old if you compare him to George Herbert, who was 39 when he died. He is survived by 6 of his 12 children. And according to Isaac Walton, who you may remember wrote that first biography of Herbert, he also writes John Donne's first biography. According to Walton, John Donne's last words were, "I were miserable if I might not die." And then he said, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Thy will be done. Now, it was not long before Donne's death that, again, even in illness towards death, he is rather self-dramatizing. And what he does is he asks a friend of his called Nicholas Stone to come over and draw a picture of him. And I now quote, "Fires were lit in the study, his clothes were removed, and he wrapped himself in a burial shroud with only his emaciated face to be seen. A sketch was made and was subsequently used by the sculptor Nicholas Stone to create the effigy in which the shrouded figure is to be seen rising from the funeral urn, with the suggestion that he is still rising and has not yet drawn himself erect." Now, this, some of you will know, it's in St. Paul's Cathedral. It's in the South Dean's aisle. I used to look at it every day as I was flipping about in my surplice, putting it on for evensong. There was John Donne looking down on me, wrapped in his shroud, coming out of his urn of ashes with a slight smug face. I think he's just sort of rather pleased he's managed salvation after all. Slightly sort of bewildered face on him. But there's an amazing thing about that effigy. When the Great Fire of London struck St. Paul's and everything's burnt down, guess what was the one thing that the fire didn't destroy? The effigy of John Donne. And if you look at it today, you can just see at the bottom the slight darkening of the marble where the fire did sort of scorch it a bit, but it didn't affect it at all. Virginia Woolf was rather taken by this fact. And she wrote this: "We still seek out Donne, even if we cannot see how so many different qualities meet together in one man. But we have only to read him, to submit to the sound of that passionate and penetrating voice, and his figure rises again across the waste of the years, more erect, more imperious, more inscrutable than any of his time. Even the elements seem to have respected that identity. When the fire of London destroyed almost every other monument in St. Paul's, it left Donne's figure untouched, as if the flames themselves found that knot too hard to undo, that riddle too difficult to read, and that figure too entirely itself to turn to common clay." A rather beautiful bit of Virginia Woolf on the effigy. As I say, it was fairly untouched. It can be viewed today in the cathedral. It is a haunting reminder of the Dean, whose mind constantly, I think, was seeking to rise out of deathly soil towards the brightness of his God. And we'll look at a couple of poems in a moment of that theme. But do you have, at this stage, just any questions about the life or anything I just said about him, the person? He's a extraordinary chicken in many ways, but no. I can carry on to the recordings. You're happy to? Right. So, what is it you're encountering when you come to a Donne poem? Well, one of the things that people note about a Donne poem are the opening lines. Okay. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty in wrath. I wonder by my troth what thou and I did till we loved. Mark but this flea. Busy old fool, unruly son. Go and catch a falling star. When my grave is broke up again. So these opening lines of the poems are often where you're first grabbed, and people are intrigued and they want to carry on. It is a voice that grabs our attention. There is some poetic personality to these lines. His language is often difficult. I think people find Donne harder to read today than Hogarth. And you often need to look at the notes a little bit more with John Donne's poems. The ideas are a bit more complex in a John Donne poem, and yet there is still some immediacy. Now, well, I want to tell you this now, but it relates really to his preaching. But John Donne was asked once, what makes a good preacher? And he said, well, it's not their cleverness, it's not their fluency, how articulate they are, it's not their brain, it's their nearness. How near to your humanity is this preacher? And if you feel that the preacher is near your humanity, that you're recognizing each other's humanity, you're continuous. And he uses this word nearness. I think he strove for it in his poems. I think he completes it better in certain parts of his sermons. But it was a word that he comes up with. And it's one I want us to remember because I think he was striving for that and at his best achieves it. There's a full force of passion and intelligence in his poems. You sometimes get the man behind the poems, although some people think, are you getting the man or are you getting the self-dramatized steamback? Did he really go off and sleep with all these women? Or is he just writing verses that he knows other men want to read? So is he promiscuous? Or actually, because Catherine Rundell doesn't think he was. He was probably like most men, sort of boasting. But actually, he was just writing things that he or his friends would like to read. So there's always this debate, and you always get this in poetry anyway, are you dealing with the real person who's writing it, or are you dealing with the persona? You have to call, though, on your own passion and intelligence to read them, I think. They're often about relationships, either with God or with another human being. So, of course, because they're about relationships, they're about difficult issues. I think you ought to read a John Donne poem aloud. Some people think he has a very what they call a rightness of tone. There's something about the tone of the poem that holds it together. Some people think, again, that it's slightly overdone, so to speak, overdone, undone. People differ about how they assess that. One of the things you note about the actual sort of rhythm of a Donne poet is that actually, although he's still using the iambic pentameter, which we talked about last week, 5 iambs in one breath, the titum of the heart with the breaths of titum, 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 titum. Shall I compare the two summer's day? he uses that, but he often ruptures it a bit, so it doesn't quite fit. And to the purists of the time, that was either risque or nonsense. And a bit later on, many of the later poets and writers really thought it was very crude. Johnson, for instance, Dryden, they started to write off John Donne. But I think these little sort of ruptures on the normal Elizabethan rhythm of a poem are a little bit like rocks that he's putting on the shoreline. So the rhythm is there, but a bit like life. There's always a bit of grit. And so you get this sense that even the lines don't quite flow as you thought they ought to. And we'll hear a little bit of that in one of them. So finally, I just want to say that the other things to look out for in the poems are you often get one-syllable words in succession. There is a lot of alliteration, a lot of repetition of sounds. You often get a rapid sequence of words or questions. There's a speed to the poem quite often, much speedier than a Herbert poem. There again, maybe that's the pastoral versus the metropolitan. There's often a directness to the poem, a statement that you say, oh, he's full on there. So you get a line like, for God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love. Right? Very direct. And you go, well, you want to know a bit more. And because of these contraries that I mentioned, you often get a lot of contrasts going on in the poetry as well. Some people think he's a great poet of love, but C.S. Lewis thought his love poems lacked love and were too heady. But again, we're not going to look at the love poems today just as well, really. Because they're a completely different ball game, except, here's the thing. If you wanted to talk about love in that Elizabethan period, you would normally turn to the sonnet form. He doesn't. He doesn't write love poems in the sonnet form at all. When does he use the sonnet form? He uses the sonnet form in his religious poems. He's trying to love God, as it were, in the sonnet. So the religious poems often do have a sonnet form. If he isn't one of the great love poets, and again, that's up for debate, he is, I think, one of the great religious poets. There's a sort of instinct in the poems to have an argument. Some sort of personal confrontation with God. And some people say, well, what's the difference between Herbert and Donne? And I would say it's something like this. As we looked at last week, Herbert had this very strong sense that God, for all the difficulties that you have in the relationship, was his friend. And I don't mean a sort of Facebook friend, 638 people that he's never been bad. This was a real friend who his loose ends, all his loose ends could find a home. And if you remember, I said that a lot of religious poems, see God up here and humanity here, you address them this way, and Herbert makes it horizontal when he starts to talk to God in a one-to-one as a friend. You don't get that sense with Donne. You're getting a lot more turmoil and self-doubt. And whereas I think Herbert knew that no matter what happened in this friendship, even if he stopped out the room and told God where to go, at the end of the day, they were going to stay together. Nothing was going to break this friendship. Nothing. Hell never gets to look in any of Herbert's poems. Which is extraordinary when you think of when he was writing. And as I say, in that last poem of his, he doesn't even use the word God. He just calls God love. So you get this sense in which, in one of his poems, he says, I can rest in this love more than I do in bed. So, Donne, however, you feel as if he doesn't quite know if he's going to be able to stay in God's good books. And we'll look at a poem now where he basically says, do you know what you've got on your hands here? This is me. This is John Donne here. And I'm not sure if we're going to pull this off together. Perhaps I'm just a bit beyond the pale because I just can't get my act together. And you get a lot more sense of turmoil going on, which, of course, I think is why he's also popular. There's a very different tone in the poems, I think, between Donne and Herbert. Let's look at a couple of things. So you've got your sheet. So I've just been talking about how he feels a bit about himself and how this is different from her. But let's then look at Holy Sonnet 10, which is on page 3. Batter my heart, three-personed God. For you is yet but knock, breathe, chime, and seek to mend. That I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town to another due, labour to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captive, and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. Last week we did this. Let's try it out now. Just turn to your neighbour and say anything that comes to mind after that poem. Anything you notice, or just anything. Please do. Does anybody like this poem? Jeff? Yes? If you're not, can you tell that George Herbert didn't write that? Yes. Yeah. Okay. And did you pick up that here there is the iambic pentameter, batter my heart, three-person God for you. But you wouldn't know because of that first word, batter. So that's a good example of the slightly ruptured rhythm that's going on. But what did you make of this? What did you feel? Violence. You said violence. Violence. Tell me wrong.
So, well, we were looking at some of the language.
Yes.
Speak with. And Kented batter is a very strong.
It's a military word, isn't it?
I started off with rattles and burns. It was I was talking about how he school teacher who was a bit interned and versatile said that really needs rape.
Yes, a lot of people will say it's about rape, ravish. I mean, some people say it's about surrender, but yes, you could read that in a very forceful way. As he is asking to be overfilled.
Yeah.
I am betrothed to your enemy.
Yeah. Stop. Divorce me. Nothing else, because motivated.
You're not getting through. Reason doesn't get through.
Yes, reason should be your viceroy, but is weak. Monk, so you can't even trust your thoughts. Yeah.
And this is it talking about being in the hand of Satan.
Well, his enemy suggests that, however you want to voice it, something not of God.
The bigger world,
The world, maybe.
in the sense of calling these are
Yeah. Like a usurped town to another Jew. So I'm living as if I'm not in your kingdom. I'm in somebody else's, perhaps my own, but not yours. Enthrall, of course, means enslave. So, except you make me a slave, I'm never going to be free. What about that line, yet dearly I love you?
Yes. That I was just thinking that's completely different in tone from all of the rest of the
Does it feel authentic or inauthentic in this?
In this kind, it feels very authentic.
Yeah.
Like it must have cost him an awful lot to get that like that. This little
Yeah.
and church.
What picture of Donne are you getting after reading this?
Stubbs tense struggle. I mean, he does sound labor to admit to you, but that doesn't work. It's like, over to you. I can't do it.
The contrariness.
Contrarian.
Well, he stood. Fantastic.
Yes. Restless life.
Yes. Quite a trouble.
Then he
Trouble.
Anderson.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's look now at the poem pages. No. Let's look at page 4.
Yeah.
What hope?
A hymn to God the Father. Wilt thou forgive that sin where I begun, which was my sin, though it were done before? Wilt thou forgive that sin through which I run, and do run still, though still I do deplore? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. Wilt thou forgive that sin which I have won others to sin, and made my sin their door? Wilt thou forgive that sin which I did shun a year or two, but wallowed in a score? When thou hast done, thou hast not done it, for I have more. I have a sin of fear, that when I have spun my last thread, I shall perish on the shore. But swear by thyself that at my death thy sun shall shine as he shines now and heretofore. And having done that, thou hast done. I fear no more. Oops. Just quick chat with your neighbour about that and how you think it relates to the first. So how are we comparing this in tone and feel to the first? Different? Not entirely. What's the tone of the poem? Is it sort of quieter?
quiet.
Sort of
Self-safety.
yes. And of course you've picked up the punning with Donne, but of course also his wife. Have more, I have more.
As but
And of course, there are two senses about this line, aren't there? Thou hast not done. It could mean, God, you've got more to do here. Or it could just be a statement, you don't have done. I haven't, you haven't got me yet. Thou hast not done, for I have more. Do people prefer this poem to the first one? Or yes? Why did you prefer it?
I'm not and emotional.
Emotional. What's the line that
Lucy May, stop putting on the salt down the side.
What about person on the show? I was saying it reminded me of someone who's doing this on the show. Listen.
Yes.
There's one line that often makes me. I once wrote this out with a son, and I had to stop because it suddenly I felt my eyes pricking up, and it's that beautiful line. I think I have a sin of fear. I have a sin of fear. Speaking with that he has fear, but he knows it's not right. You don't be. And of course, we're told that the most quoted verse in the whole Bible is "Do not be afraid." And I think it's rather beautiful that he acknowledges that this fear that's in him is actually simple, but he's got. This is the nearest poem I think he gets to that sort of Herbert-esque ending. There is a sort of sense, a slight sense of coming into harmony, although it is aspirational.
I think it's quite shocking. Lies in verse where he tells God to swear by him. No.
Yes.
I'm not sure you repeat that.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, God's got to swear on God's certainly so.
But he can't swear on it.
Thy sun shall shine as he shines now.
Yeah, but that's all this. For me, it's a sort of plea to God to like to give a little certainty or confidence. Yes, in the answer. Yes.
There's a poem which I commend to you. It's not on the sheet where it's written. They think he wrote it about 8 days before he died, and it's another hymn to God in his sickness. And so there's a lovely image there that he sort of knows the game's part, and he's getting ready for the journey where the angelic choir's on, and he basically says he's now just trying to tune the instrument. And I think that there is a lot of that sense in him, what the prayer book calls time for amendment of life. I think Donne was conscious that time was for amendment of his life, and he is trying to tune himself better. But he doesn't quite know if his music's going to be liked or not. Cool. Talking of death, let's look at Sonnet 6, which is on page 2. Now, you're probably all fed up with me reading these poems my own way. If you want to hear these poems read, there is still on BBC Sounds on the radio a rather nice half-an-hour programme on Donne called Faith in Poetry. And it's brilliant. I mean, I am this. There are other people in it, and the reason I'm telling you to listen to it, not because of that, but Simon Russell Beat reads these poems in such a way that you will have to pull the car as well to listen to it, because he reads them so beautifully, particularly this Holy Sonnet 6. Death, be not proud. Though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure. Then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones, and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Let's break start. Just your neighbour again. What do you make of this term? Okay. Who likes this verb? You like this?
I'll have some is.
What translate that?
Well, I mean, it is so different in tone from the others. Has the sort of confidence and this way in which vision seeing death as this, not this big deal, but it's like just it's a human thing that happens to people, and that's a much more important and powerful level that is to like a
Soul's delivery.
yeah.
Death as a midwife. It's delivering soul. Yeah. Nothing else. Did other people like this poetry?
Very yes.
No, who said no? Yeah. Tell us what you did.
There seems to be no hope in it back then, and I find it very depressing. Weird, interesting.
Except we were having a sort of discussion as to what the last two, very beautiful fast the last two lines. But I was thinking it's almost the same fact. He said, "Yes, it was." It's
Yes.
I was saying, no, it's the same fact.
Yes.
And I sort of was wondering whether is he saying they're both the same thing, once you get beyond a certain point. Or is it what he hopes for this to say, what is? I don't like the optimism of it. What, this is what's done? Great. Mm-hmm.
But he was about to die.
Yeah.
Well, we don't quite know when you wrote this. There is certainly more. I mean, the faith in it as it comes a bit stronger, doesn't it? A bit more assured.
Yeah.
Death, thou shalt die. You know, again, monosyllables hammering just out. Quite assured, I think. We've only got a few more minutes left. I just want to talk very quickly about him as a preacher to you. So he was famous as a preacher when he died, and he preached. The average John Donne sermon was not 10 minutes. It was probably about 50 minutes to an hour.
Right.
I have actually heard one of these sermons preached, read out by a friend of mine who's professor of English at Oxford, who's a specialist in Donne, Peter McCulloch, and he's actually read out one of it. Now, what happens? There's a lot of Latin in it. It's true. I often wonder whether people making the lyrics. What happens is that you tend to dress in and out. It's probably a bit like Soames East. And something's said, and you go, "Oh, that's interesting." He was like, and then you come back into it. And if you had asked me what was that sermon about at the end, I could really be pushed to tell you. But we were all nearly in tears at the end of it. There was something very beautiful about the whole. It's very, very strange to experience. And although I think he probably wrote it as a river with an argument, it flowed, actually I think it works as a fountain. People draw from it. I think the best sermon is a fountain in salt rivers by Southern. But there's no doubt that he put in a lot of work into his sermons. And once he delivered one, we're told that he went and started the next week's. They were 50 minutes. Sometimes, if it was a special occasion, they could be up to 2 hours. No microphone system. So what people were hearing, of course, it might be like Monty Python. The first thing, let's have the cheeseburger. And of course, he sometimes preached outside the cathedral at St. Paul's Cross, where they would build scaffolding. And you, if you were wealthy, would send your servant to go and nabby the best seat. I'd like, some nabbing with the cool seat with their channel, so that you got the seats where you'd actually hear it. But there can often be about 2,000 people outside if he was preaching outside. And he also preached at court and at Lincoln's Inn and so on. And the book by Rundell begins by there were so many people at Lincoln's Inn trying to hear him that one person got crushed and was killed. So, there wasn't much TV in those days. You had to get out. But one of the reasons people like sermons is because it was one way they picked up the news. Because if you were a preacher, so Paul's, you were probably quite, you knew what's going on in the world, probably more than most, and you would slip in quite a lot of news into your sermon, and people would, pick it up and rather enjoy hearing it. Some people say, well, how the hell did he remember all this? Because the other thing about Donne is he never read his sermons, he learned them. So although he wrote them, he remembered them all. And he tells us, actually, how he does that. It's sort of classical Roman Cicero way of remembering rhetoric. You imagine a big house, and you say, in the hallway, I'm going to tell them about this. And I'm going to move into the living room, and I'm going to tell them that. I'm going to go upstairs, and I'm going to tell them this. I will go to the bedroom, and then I'm going to make my way out of the house to the garden, and I'll tell them this. And he remembers this sort of procession around the house as a way of remembering what he wants to say. T.S. Eliot, who was a great fan of Donne and did a lot to revive his reputation, does say, there is the shadow of the impure motives about Donne, generally. But of course, again, surely that's one of the things that draws us, the shadow of the impure motive. But here's a little section from a sermon he gave at St. Paul's on Christmas Day in 1624 on page 5. And I think, and I hope, you'll be able to hear the poet at work in the pulpit. God made sun and moon to distinguish seasons, and day and night. And we cannot have the fruits of the earth but in their seasons. But God hath made no decree to distinguish the seasons of his mercies. In paradise, the fruits were ripe the first minute, and in heaven it is always autumn. His mercies are ever in their maturity. We ask our daily bread, and God never says, you should have come yesterday. He never says, you must again tomorrow, but today, if ye will hear his voice, today he will hear you. If some king of the earth hath so large an extent of dominion in north and south, as that he hath winter and summer together in his dominions, so large an extent east and west, as that he hath day and night together in his dominions, much more hath God mercy and judgment together. He brought light out of darkness, not out of a lesser light. He can bring thy summer out of winter, though thou have no spring. Though in the ways of fortune or understanding or conscience thou have been benighted till now, wintered and frozen, clouded and eclipsed, damped and benumbed, smothered and stupefied till now, now God comes to thee, not as in the dawning of the dead, not as in the bud of the spring, but as the sun at noon, to illustrate all shadows as the sheaves in harvest, to fill all penuries.
all occasions invite his mercies, at all times by his sin.
Can you hear the poet?
Yes.
Rather beautiful, I think.
Yeah.
So it is 8:30, but you find about some recommended reading if you're interested in taking up Donne a bit more. But here on the page 6, you'll see another little bit of another Christmas sermon he preached 3 years later. And maybe this is given to the Church of England today with a loving kiss. As God loves sympathy, God loves symphony. God loves the compassion and fellow feeling of others' miseries. That is sympathy. And God loves harmony and fellow believing of others' doctrines. So that is symphony. No man alone makes a church. No one church alone makes a Catholic church. And I think Donne was always pursuing sympathy, nearness, but also symphony of creation and of God, that music that he was trying to tune his heart to. Okay? I can mention to you, like this.
Thank you.